Alright guys, we are now about to start our second unit of the semester, and it's going to be all about ecology. So we're going to take a little bit of a shift. So far up to this point in biology, we've covered most things on the cellular level or below. We've covered, different reactions that take place in the cell, cell parts, cell functions like protein synthesis, and now we're getting ready to move into kind of the larger scale of biology. And so a lot of times ecology is covered at the end of the unit or the end of the year, but I actually prefer to cover it before we cover evolution because a lot of evolutionary relationships go back to ecology. And normally students feel a little more comfortable with ecology. It's something that they've been doing for a while, and it's not nearly as abstract as, say, DNA technology. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this unit. It will be a quick unit in that we only have just a few sets of notes. We'll be testing and then moving on to evolution. So I'm sorry if the video sounds bad. My voice is not 100%, but I needed to get this video done today. So I apologize if it sounds a little different than normal. So let's go ahead and get rolling. So ecology, what is it? It's the study of organisms and their environment and how they interact with each other. And so if we go back to our organization of life, we know that the life begins with the cell. And then cells make up tissues, which make up organs, which make up organ systems. And at this point, we're going to be focusing on the organism because it's the study of organisms and their environment. So we're going to be looking at the organism and up. And so we really do need to just memorize this organization if you don't already know it. We need to know that organisms make up a population. Several populations make up a community. Communities plus the non-living factors make an ecosystem. Similar ecosystems form biomes, and then all of the biomes make up the living earth or biosphere. And so we're going to primarily be focusing on population ecology. We'll also look at communities and biomes as we go throughout this unit. And so a population is a group of like organisms. A lot of times we call these the same species. So you could have like a population of cardinals, a population of earthworms, a population of oak trees. And then several populations living together is going to be a community. Now, within an ecosystem, we look at not only the living populations, but we also look at the non-living factors that are in that area. And so we have biotic versus abiotic factors. Biotic factors are living things or even things that were once living. And then abiotic factors are things that are not alive and were never alive. Things like air, oxygen gas, light. Those things that living things cannot live without, but yet they are not living themselves. So within an ecosystem, every organism, every population has what's called its ecological niche or niche, however you want to say it. And essentially it's all of the resources that it uses within that ecosystem. And the resources, we could talk about them in terms of possible or actual. And this is something that's new, something that we really didn't cover freshman year. We did talk about niche, but here we're going to talk about fundamental versus realized. And so the fundamental is essentially what are all of the resources that that organism or that population could potentially use, whereas realized are the ones that they actually do. So just to kind of give you an example, as a person who worked at Pleasant Grove, whenever lunchtime came around, there were several different restaurants that we could go to if we wanted to run and grab lunch. I could go to Chick-fil-A, I could go to Sonic, Burger King, Golden Chick, all different kinds of restaurants, but I didn't necessarily go to all of them. I may have only gone to 3 of all of the ones that are possible. And so fundamental are what we could use. There could be birds that could nest in several different types of trees. That would be fundamental. But if they actually only nest in 2 different trees or 2 different types of trees, then that would be their realized. So the only difference is that fundamental is all of the possible resources that that organism could use, and realized are the ones that they actually do. All right, one big thing in ecology are these interactions because we're studying how living things interact with their environment, but we also look at how living things interact with each other. And so these interspecific, this word up here, inter, means between, and specific is referring to species. So we're technically talking about relationships between 2 different species. They could be good relationships, they could be bad relationships, or they could be kind of neutral. And so we're going to take a look at each of these. And these relationships play a big role in an organism's life. It also can affect evolution. Um, these relationships could also lead to extinction. And so this is just something that's a big part of organisms and their environment. And so one type of interaction that's actually a lose-lose, notice it's negative for both parties, is competition. And competition is any time there is a limitation on resources. And it's very rare that there's zero competition. Normally there's always going to be limitation in terms of food, water, territory. And so the more limited the resource that is, the more competition it will create. And so competition can actually keep two species from occupying the exact same niche, because too much competition is going to lead ultimately to the death of the weaker species. And so a lot of times what you'll see is like resource partitioning. Organisms may specialize and focus on maybe different parts of the food source, or maybe be very specific about their food or their home. But they do that so that way they can kind of live in harmony a little bit better. Now, competition could also be intraspecific. Intra means within. So like if you have competition between two males within a species, that would be an intraspecific type of competition. Our next type of relationship is predation. Now it's going to be positive for the predator. The predator is the one that's eating, and it's going to be negative for the prey because the prey is getting eaten. And we see this as part of our food chains and food webs. Both predator and prey are usually well adapted to that role. Predator is going to have traits that allow it to catch food and eat it. Maybe things like speed or claws or camouflage. Where the prey also have adaptations. They could also be camouflage. They could also have spines. We see things like mimicry. So predator and prey relationships definitely can lead to some adaptations and in order to survive in those environments. And then our third relationship is symbiosis, or you may have heard symbiotic relationships. And there's actually three main types of symbiosis. And depending on the relationship, that depends on the outcome or whether it's positive or negative for a particular party. So the first symbiotic relationship is mutualism. And we kind of probably in freshman year, we maybe use smiley face, smiley face. But mutualism is a win-win. This is where both species benefit. So examples of mutualism include things like pollinators and flowers. The pollinators get food and the flowers get help in reproduction. Mutualism can be found inside of us. We have mutualistic bacteria that live within our gut and they help us digest food. And they also get a warm, cozy place to live and a constant food supply. Another type of symbiosis is commensalism. And commensalism is where one benefits and the other really doesn't care. So this could be happy face, neutral face. And so we see commensalism in examples like a fern growing under a tree. The fern benefits from the shade of the tree, but the tree doesn't care. Orchids growing on a tree. The orchids get closer to light, but the tree doesn't care. We could see commensalism when things are getting a free ride, like barnacles on a well. The barnacles get a free ride and they get transport to new locations to eat, but the well is not affected by the barnacles riding on them. And then we have parasitism, and parasitism is a happy, sad. Parasitism, the parasite is going to benefit, and the parasite is always getting nutrition, and then the host is going to be hurt because they are having nutrients stolen from them. So the parasite benefits and the host does not. Now, a parasite could be an endoparasite, which means it is like living inside of the host, or it could be an ectoparasite, which means it's on the outside. So like endo would be a tapeworm, ecto would be a tick. Now, all three of these are close relationships between two species, and because these relationships are so close, they could lead to something called coevolution. And we'll talk about this again when we get to evolution, but this is where a change in one leads to a change in the other. So if you have a change in the host, there could be a change in the parasite over time in order to continue using that host. So we do see these relationships affecting evolution in populations. Excuse me. All right, so our next topic is going to be energy in an ecosystem. And energy is essential, okay? The sun is going to be our original energy source for all of our organisms. And that leads to these trophic levels or this trophic structure because all organisms need food and energy to survive. And so each step in your food chain or food web is considered a trophic level. So the trophic level that is going to be the most energy efficient are your autotrophs or your producers. And these are the ones that have the ability to make their own food. Most of them are going to be photosynthetic, things like plants and algae. Some of them can carry out a process called chemosynthesis, and this is going to be in environments where there is no light, like maybe bottom of the ocean or maybe in a cave. Some of your bacteria are able to take chemicals from the earth and turn them into food. But the key to an autotroph is that they are making the food for themselves. They are not having to consume. And so they are the basis of all food webs. And normally, if your producers are doing well, then the rest of your ecosystem is probably thriving. If we have low production, the rest of the ecosystem is probably not doing too well. Another trophic level are going to be your heterotrophs, and we can classify these as either consumers, they could also be decomposers, but a heterotroph is just something that relies on another organism for food. So they have to eat or they get their nutrition from somewhere else. They're not able to make it for themselves. And so this does include consumers that we can put into different levels depending on what they eat. A primary consumer eats a producer, and these are going to be your herbivores, your plant eaters, as well as your omnivores, the ones that are both plant and meat eaters. A secondary consumer eats a primary, and so these are going to be your omnivores and some carnivores. And then your tertiary eat your secondary consumers. So as we're moving up these trophic levels, we're going to start to see more meat eaters to the point where they may only be carnivores. And there could actually be another level, the quaternary. You could take it up another level. It typically doesn't go much higher than quaternary because it's an energy thing, and we'll talk about it here in a moment. But you could see these various levels. Now, you are not confined to one, because if you have a varied diet, there's a good chance that you would be considered both a primary, secondary, tertiary, and maybe even a quaternary consumer. Now, something else to consider is that detritivores and scavengers, these are also consumers. A lot of times people want to put these in the decomposer category. Scavengers are eating dead material, but they're still consuming. And detritivores are consuming decayed material, so they are also still consuming. And then we have our decomposers. These are going to be heterotrophs as well because they do not make food for themselves. But they actually get their energy not by eating, but by breaking down the remains of other living things and then kind of absorbing those nutrients. So typically your decomposers are going to be fungi like mushrooms. There are bacteria that can decompose and maybe some insects, but for the most part you're talking fungi and bacteria. And so we can represent these trophic levels using some diagrams. We can show the flow of energy. Once again, the sun is the original source, or chemicals if there's no light. The energy is going to pass from the sun to your autotrophs, and then the autotrophs will pass energy on to the various heterotrophs. And so we can use a food chain or a food web to represent these relationships. A food chain is more simplistic. It's just kind of a 1, 2, 3, 4, whereas a food web is a bit more complex. It has all the different food chains put together. And so here's an example of a food web for a kelp forest. And so we have our producers, things like algae. Notice they don't really have arrows pointing to them. What you need to understand about the food chain and the food web is what the arrow is pointing to. The arrow is always pointing to where the energy is going, so it's going to the eater, whoever is eating or consuming. And so the algae is consumed by these small herbivores and invertebrates. These are going to be consumed by sea stars and crabs and so forth. And so you can look at a food web and you can identify producers, you can identify the various levels of consumers. You should also be able to answer questions of things like what would happen if this organism were removed, because any change to an ecosystem is going to affect the food web. And so almost all organisms will be affected anytime an organism is removed. And so this energy transfer is pretty important because in order to survive and to have all of our metabolism working as it needs to, we must have this energy, so we must have to eat Producers must have to make it for themselves. But this energy transfer is really not super efficient. As we move from trophic level to trophic level, a lot of the energy is lost in the form of heat. Some of it's going to be used by the consumer, and then much of it's going to be just lost in that random form of energy. And so really only about 10% of the energy is available from one trophic level to the next. And so we use these energy pyramids to represent this energy loss as we go from trophic level to trophic level. And this is why you typically don't see much higher than a quaternary consumer, because the higher you go, the less energy those organisms are getting from the food that they eat. And so it really means that they also have to eat a lot more. Your upper level carnivores and consumers are going to have to consume a lot more food than, say, an herbivore, because there's less energy in the food that they're eating. And so here's some examples of energy pyramids. And you can just kind of follow the basic rule of 10%. And so if you're having to read energy pyramids, as you move up the levels, you just simply remove a zero because only 10% is being transferred. So here we have 1,000 kilocalories available in the producers, but only 100% of that is able to be used by the primary consumer. And then only 10% of that, or 10 kilocalories, is available to the next level and available to the next level. So you can see we're just taking away a zero with each step. Also notice that we can support fewer and fewer organisms as we move up the table. So the biomass is decreasing as well. So a whole field of grass can support X number of grasshoppers, that can support a smaller number of the moles, and that can support a smaller number of your owls. So you can see that the number of organisms is also decreasing along with the energy. All right, biodiversity. Biodiversity is just the differences within the living organisms, and there's actually different types of biodiversity. We could be talking about species richness, which are how many different organisms live in an area. So like, for instance, the rainforest has a very high species richness. You'll find more unique species in the rainforest than any other terrestrial biome. It could also include the genetic diversity, or the alleles that are available within a population. And it could also include ecosystem diversity, such as the different biomes, things like deserts or a pond or the rainforest. And so biodiversity is going to be affected by location. So typically, if you're closer to the equator, where you get more direct sunlight, you're going to have more producers and therefore more variety. And as you move away from the equator, typically biodiversity is going to decrease. Now there's lots of threats to biodiversity, and the main one is going to be us. Unfortunately, we have a really bad habit of not taking care of the environment around us. If you are in or have taken DC Environmental, you know that humans are really not very good a lot of the times when it comes to biodiversity. We like to destroy habitats to make room for our things, our homes, our stores, our restaurants. We can be responsible for introducing new species. Sometimes it's not us, but a lot of times we are the ones who are introducing species into places they don't belong. And what can happen is these species can become invasive. You're going to have a little article to read about an invasive species tomorrow. And so what can happen is these introduced species, when you introduce a new organism to an environment where it is not native, they don't really have the natural competitors and predators. And so what happens is they just grow like crazy. And a lot of times they can take over and cause other species to become extinct. We overexploit, overhunt, overfish, overuse. And anytime we make changes to the environment, we can definitely disrupt food chains. Now, we're not the only threat to biodiversity. There could be some things that could affect it, like natural disasters, which climate change does kind of come back on us as well. There could be geologic change, like changes in mountains and valleys and just the rocks and earth. And there could also be changes in weather. And so ecosystem stability, usually the more diversity you have, the more stable it is, because diversity equals better chance of survival. Greater diversity equals greater resilience. And this is going to be true in all forms of diversity. The more diversity we have, the better chance that organisms will survive within a population, that populations will survive within an ecosystem. So there's a lot of different disturbances though, and so ecosystems are constantly changing. And these disturbances could be natural or they could be human related. But any change to an ecosystem is going to affect the energy available. Those food chains and food webs are going to be affected. And so anytime we have disturbances, it's going to lead to changes in those ecosystems, which we refer to as ecological succession. Now we can look at ecological succession in kind of two large scale ways, and we've got primary versus secondary. And the key difference is what we are starting with, okay? In primary succession, we are starting in an area with no soil, okay? So essentially you have bare rock. This could be a volcanic island. This could be a location where a glacier receded and it's just leaving the bare rock behind. This could be something like concrete parking lot that's abandoned. Essentially, we're starting with rock or no soil. Now, secondary succession, there's at least soil in place. So typically there's a disturbance that clears an area, but we at least have soil, and so that's going to shave off some of the time. Now, both of these are going to take time. And what we see in the case of succession is a general progression. Okay, so the pioneer species are the organisms that are the first to inhabit an area. Now, if we're talking about primary succession, it's typically going to be lichens because plants require soil. And so lichens are actually a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and an algae. It can also be a fungus and a bacteria, but essentially you have a microorganism that is photosynthetic and you have a fungi that's really good at absorbing. And these lichens can look kind of mossy or lettucey. You can find lichens growing on the sides of tombstones. You can find them growing on mountains. Lichens are very hardy. They can grow in very harsh conditions. And over time, what they can do is they can slowly create soil. So if you're starting off in primary succession, lichens are going to be your pioneer species. Now, if you have secondary succession, the soil is still intact. And so your pioneer species may be something like small grasses, or small weedy plants. And so what will happen though is you have a general progression. Once you have soil, you can get grasses and small plants, and then that's going to later on give way to larger plants, bigger like bushes, softwood trees, all the way up to hardwood trees. And that succession can continue until you reach what's called a climax community. And that's essentially a very stable, flourishing ecosystem that's somewhat balanced. But it can start over at any time because these disturbances are always going to be factors. And so a forest fire could occur, some kind of natural disaster, and it could start all over again. So ecological succession is just something that is ongoing. So here's an example of what it could look like. So in primary succession, we start with these exposed rocks. Lichens and mosses can grow, and we're going to increase in our plants over time. And normally the more producers you have, the more animal life you will have as well. And then with secondary succession, here we have a forest fire. Notice we don't have to start with the lichens, but we can start with your small weedy plants all the way up to your climax community. And that is going to wrap up our first lesson on ecology. We actually covered quite a bit of material, but I hope that felt somewhat familiar to you. So you're going to have an activity to do. It's going to focus on some of these topics, and then you're also going to have a quiz here in a couple of days. So hope you guys understood it. If you have any questions, just let me know, and hopefully I will talk to you soon.